The call came at 2:40 in the afternoon. A nurse, very calm, very careful with her words, told me my wife had been found sitting alone in a hallway outside the imaging department, crying for almost 20 minutes before anyone noticed. I asked where my son-in-law was. He was the one who'd taken her to that appointment, since I was 3 states away at a work conference. When I called him, he sounded genuinely confused. "I don't know what happened," he said. "I stepped out to take a call, and when I came back, she was just upset. I have no idea why." The hospital's hallway camera, which I requested to see 2 days later, told a very different story. My name's Harold. My wife, Margaret, had a routine follow-up imaging appointment scheduled to check on a spot doctors had been monitoring for the past several months. Nothing confirmed yet, but the kind of appointment that carries real anxiety regardless of how routine anyone calls it. I was supposed to take her myself. A work conference I'd already postponed once got rescheduled at the last minute, landing directly on top of her appointment date, with genuinely no flexibility left to move it again without serious professional consequences. Our daughter, Renee, was traveling for her own job that week, so when her husband, Curtis, offered to take Margaret instead, it seemed like a reasonable, even generous solution. Curtis and Margaret had always gotten along fine, as far as I knew. Pleasant, easy. The kind of relationship that doesn't require much examination because nothing ever seemed to strain it. I left for my conference reassured that Margaret was in good hands, checking in by text the morning of her appointment, getting a simple, "All set, Curtis is picking me up at 1" in response. That was the last normal update I got before the hospital called me directly that afternoon. The nurse who called me, a woman named Diane, explained the situation as gently as she could. Margaret had finished her imaging around 1:45. The technician had walked her back out to the main hallway, where Curtis had been waiting, and then returned to her next patient. About 20 minutes later, a different staff member doing routine rounds found Margaret sitting alone on a bench in that same hallway, visibly crying, with no one else around her. When asked if she was all right, Margaret reportedly said only that she just needed a minute, declining further explanation, clearly not wanting to make a scene in a public hallway. Staff located Curtis eventually, out in the parking garage, on his phone. Diane said he came back inside quickly once notified, seemed appropriately concerned in front of staff, and escorted Margaret to the car himself shortly after. I called Curtis directly the moment I got off the phone with Diane. He sounded exactly as confused as you'd expect a genuinely innocent person to sound. "I don't know what happened," he repeated. "I stepped out for like 5 minutes to take a work call. When I came back, she was already upset. I really don't know why." 5 minutes, according to hospital staff, had actually been closer to 25. I flew home 2 days earlier than planned, genuinely unsettled by the discrepancy between Curtis's 5 minutes and the staff's much longer timeline. Margaret, when I asked her directly, gave me a version that matched Curtis's story almost word for word, vague, minimizing, clearly uncomfortable discussing it further. "I think the appointment just got to me," she said. "It's nothing, Harold. I'm fine." I believed at the time that this might genuinely be true, medical anxiety manifesting as a private emotional moment, nothing more sinister than that. But something about how quickly both Margaret and Curtis wanted the conversation closed kept nagging at me in a way I couldn't fully dismiss. I called the hospital's patient services department and requested access to the hallway security footage from that day, explaining the discrepancy in timelines as my reason. It took 2 days and a formal written request, but they eventually agreed to let me view it in person, given that I was Margaret's listed emergency contact and spouse. I sat in a small administrative office with a hospital security officer, watching grainy but perfectly clear hallway footage, time-stamped from 1:45 that afternoon. Margaret came out of imaging, visibly tired but composed, and sat down beside Curtis on the waiting bench. For the first few minutes, nothing unusual. Quiet conversation, Curtis checking his phone occasionally, ordinary waiting room behavior. Then, at 1:52, Curtis pulled a folded document out of his jacket pocket and handed it to Margaret. I paused the footage and asked the security officer to confirm the timestamp, my stomach already tightening, before I even fully understood what I was looking at. Margaret read through the document for almost 2 full minutes, her posture shifting visibly, shoulders tensing, head shaking slightly. Curtis leaned in close, talking, gesturing toward specific lines on the page. At 1:58, Margaret shook her head firmly, handed the document back, and said something that made Curtis's expression harden noticeably. He didn't leave for a phone call at that point. He stayed seated beside her for almost 10 more minutes, the conversation clearly continuing, Margaret's body language growing smaller, more closed off, until finally, at 2:09, Curtis stood up abruptly, said something short, and walked away down the hallway, not toward the parking garage where he later claimed to have been making a work call, but toward a quiet side corridor where the footage showed him standing alone, not on his phone at all, just standing there for several minutes before eventually walking back toward the garage. Margaret remained on that bench, alone, for the next 18 minutes, exactly as the staff member had described, before anyone noticed her crying. I confronted Margaret with what I'd seen that same evening, gently, but directly. She broke down almost immediately, relieved, I think, to finally not be carrying it alone. The document Curtis had brought to that appointment was a co-signing request for a business loan. Curtis and Renee's small home renovation company had taken on significant debt expanding too quickly, and Curtis wanted Margaret to co-sign a substantial loan using her and my retirement savings as partial collateral, framing it as just a formality and pressuring her to sign it immediately, specifically while I was unreachable at my conference and unable to weigh in. Margaret had refused, clearly and firmly, even while emotionally raw from an anxiety-inducing medical appointment. Curtis, rather than simply accepting her answer, had pushed harder, growing visibly frustrated when she wouldn't budge, before finally walking away from her entirely, rather than continuing to wait through her actual emotional moment with any real support. He hadn't been confused about what happened at all. He'd simply decided that I don't know what happened was easier to say to me than the truth, that he'd brought financial pressure into a vulnerable medical appointment, gotten frustrated when it didn't work, and left his mother-in-law crying alone in a hospital hallway rather than face the conversation honestly. I confronted Curtis directly once Renee was back in town, with Margaret present, laying out exactly what the footage showed versus what he'd told me on the phone that day. He didn't have much of a defense once the timeline was that clearly documented. Renee was furious, on multiple levels, at the loan attempt itself, at the timing, and at the dishonesty about what had actually happened to her own mother. Curtis and Renee found other financing for their business eventually, without involving either of us, and the relationship between Curtis and Margaret has been notably more distant since, polite but careful in a way it never used to be. I don't know if Curtis ever fully understood why leaving Margaret crying alone in that hallway bothered me more than the loan request itself. The loan request was just bad judgment under financial pressure. Walking away from someone in genuine distress, then lying about it afterward, was something else entirely. If this story got to you, the next one is even more unexpected. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss it.